Hello everybody and welcome back. Now in today's video we're talking about the effects of war, social effects, and demographic effects. Now in this video the reason why we're tackling two major parts together is because after World War I, as you're going to see, they are pretty much the same. They really tie together. Now, what is social? Well, social is a community or a group of people having a common tradition, interests, or institutions. The way we interact, or just a overall community of people that come together. Whereas demographic means the way different people or different groups of people interact with each other. Usually when we're talking about social groups, we're talking about, groups that are the athletes or the people who are really into anime. And demographic is the popular versus the less popular, the rich versus the poor. So we're talking about two different aspects here, but for World War I, as we are going to see, they kind of have the exact same effect, or they have the exact same change with the exact same social communities and demographics. So this video is going to be combined into one for that purpose. So let's dive into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is the social effects in Europe. Now, the social effects in Europe really comes down to the fact that the war was the first time that something like this occurred in history on a very global scale. And by global scale, I do mean that in a worldwide context, that when we look at World War I, we have populations from all over the world fighting under a common flag or a common banner or a common push. You had Great Britain calling upon all of their colonies, France calling on their colonies, Germany calling on their colonies, the United States calling on their colonies. And so because of this, because of all these different peoples, all these different groups coming together, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your culture, although race did play a big factor in terms of the United States and most of the colonial powers, but in spite of that, it didn't necessarily matter where you came from. It didn't matter what you looked like, but it didn't matter where you came from, because in the trenches, in this right here, it is called the Great Equalizer. It was the fact that this war broke down every social group that mattered, whether you were an untouchable from India, or if you were a low class or less economically well-off European, if you were from royalty or if you came from money. None of that mattered. It didn't matter what your group was or where you came from. The war came, consumed, and killed all. And it is because of this, the fact that whatever your social status was in society, you still fought under the British flag, under the French flag, under the German flag, so on and so forth. And so because of that, one of the largest effects in Europe was a complete breakdown of class. In the trenches, for those 4 years, there wasn't really a rich and poor. There really wasn't you fought from that colony, you fought from this colony, we're not going to trust you. It was, all right, we have the colony over there, we have the mix of population over there, and we have the enemy in front of us. Ready? Go. So this social effect after the war has a lot of people doubting, second guessing, and really pushing the envelope on questioning society, on what all of this means, how this all equals out, and what does this mean for the future. It is because of this new interpretation, is because of these new thoughts, that different ideologies start flying around faster and sooner. This is where we start seeing fascism, who says, yes, there's no difference between classes. You see communism come back up with everyone is equal. Right? You see these ideologies that really start pushing on, it doesn't matter where you came from because we're all the same. Now, this social effect in Europe wasn't necessarily what was felt everywhere else, specifically in the Americas. In the Americas, we get the iconic picture that we see now of the roaring 20s, where there are champagne, sexual liberation, women get the right to vote, there's just celebration and fun and innovation, and it's just this picturesque life. And it's, for the most part, accurate if we look at the lens for middle class and upper class white people. In fact, most of the Roaring 20s is only ever really looked at through the lens of like the Great Gatsby, through, the Rockefeller family or things like that. But if you were low class or you were a minority, after the war, it was a season of terror. It was a push for conservatism to revisit, like, we, the United States, are a strong, powerful nation, and we need to come through and clean up our country, clean up the way we approach things, and really make sure that we don't have immigrants, we don't have minorities who are not white Christians, in a sense, destroy our nation. And so immediately following the war, there's just terror and dismay that occurs for multiple minority groups. One of the biggest and most famous of is the Tulsa burning on June 1st, 1921, 2 years after the war is over, where a sanctuary city for Black people gets pretty much burned to the ground with bombing and machine gun fire by, the KKK and other extremist groups. So in the US, rather than having this revisiting of what it was like to die in the trench, what it was like to, exist, it was the opposite. It was very much no, we need to separate more. We need to show our superiority. We need to cleanse our nation, as some people would say. So immediately after World War I, there's a huge attack on minority groups. And so socially, it was a very dark time to be any minority, whether you were Hispanic, Black, Indigenous, Chinese, Japanese, Asian, any sort of Asian descendancy. It was a very scary time. And it's often overlooked because of the narrative that we see through middle class and high class white America. So it's kind of this interesting contradiction between the two. Now, because of this is exactly why the demographic effects matches that. That in Europe, we don't see a structure like this very often. That at the end of World War I and following World War I, Europe is suffering economically, territorially, politically, and struggling to stay afloat. And so because of that, there is a near breakdown of class. It's still there. People still divide up the nation, but it's now simpler. It's now more inclusive. It's pushed into a direction of growth with the idea that, there's no more war after this. We fought. This is the big one, and let's keep that pushing. So demographically, we see a move away from the dividing lines in society versus in the United States, where we see this structure reinforced. We see the fact that demographically there is a massive push between those who have money and those who don't, and a flaunt or a celebration or a kind of craze to show that divide. It was really revisiting and reinstituting a lot of what was starting to grow after the Civil War. And because of this, we have a very interesting dynamic on what this is going to mean when we get to World War II. Because in World War II, there's a weird shift that ends up occurring, as you will hear later on. Now in Asia, we have a very interesting situation. Rather than having a breakdown in culture, having a reestablishment of class, or having any of these major shifts we see demographically, Rather, Asia, very similar to the United States, specifically China and Japan, swing towards conservatism, but more in the pride of one's nation. There's a massive swing of nationalism, as we see with Japan and their expansion, as we see with China going into a civil war, trying to decide what's going to be best for the country. So globally, we have this kind of like 3 different part system that countries go to: breaking down of demographic groups, reinforcing of demographic groups, or pushing these new demographic groups into another direction. So it's really interesting when we think of World War I and how this lasting effect occurred globally.